And yet still, when we're talking about recovery out of COVID, how do we measure recovery? Incremental increases in GDP. We are so stuck in this narrow cognitive bandwidth that we cannot dare to imagine.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Facing Future TV and today's program titled A New Economics to Face Down the Threat of Constant Growth. I am Raya Salter, your host for this evening. I am joined on my left by Dr. Catherine Trebeck, Senior Strategic Advisor for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, a group she co-founded, and the author of The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy, which was published in 2019. I'm also joined on my right by Mr. Jonathan Crook, who is a policy officer at Carbon Market Watch. So, the big news out of COP today is, of course, that the UN has released a draft agreement. The draft notes and encourages climate justice. It urges countries to speed up efforts to get off fossil fuel and stop burning coal. But this is far short of the decisive action that I think all of us want to see, need to see, and we're hoping to see out of COP. I think the strongest provision we're seeing now is that nations revisit and strengthen the 2030 targets in their nationally determined contributions as necessary to agree with the Paris Agreement by the end of 2022. So that's where we are after all of this meeting, is that by the end of next year, countries should be strengthening what they promised to do in 2015. Meanwhile, science continues to tell us that we are not only in an urgent climate crisis, but that it's worse than we previously thought. The recent Global Carbon Budget Report states that the increase in greenhouse gas emissions has risen faster than anticipated, leaving the world with even less time to take decisive climate action to stop or reduce complete climate catastrophe. So, what is truly causing the climate crisis? And one root cause of the climate crisis is unrestrained growth, with no accounting for pollution, waste, or environmental harms. Look at this slide by illustration. I like to show this slide to students. This is world energy use on a timeline that's not that far back, 1850, I believe. And you can see the explosive growth in energy use, and this is only energy, in various sectors that our modern life has brought us. Contrast that with the IPCC, the temporal scale of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of what was caused by humans, and you'll see that that timeline really tracks that explosive growth that really is in many of our lifetimes. There are, however, alternate ways to look at economic systems, including ecological economics. Ecological economics seeks pathways to governing economic activity in a way that promotes human well-being, well-being of the natural world, sustainability, and justice. So to start this conversation on ecological economics, we will begin with a video from Professor Luis Marques, Senior Professor of History from the University of Brazil, and author of Capitalism and Environmental Collapse, that was released in 2020.
My name is Luis Marques, I'm from Brazil, and this is my contribution to Facing Future TV. Global Capitalism, the Impossible Decarbonization. The reason d'etre of this meeting, as well as of all 25 COPs that preceded it, is the urgent need to decarbonize the economy to avoid catastrophic warming. There is, however, a little secret we all share. Our globalized economy will not decarbonize. It remains hopelessly dependent on carbon endless growth. The global economy is driven mainly by two corporate systems whose appetite for carbon is insatiable. The first one, of course, is the energy system. The second one is the food system, which corresponds to 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. Total greenhouse gas emissions from the food system were about 16 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2018, or 1/3 of the global anthropogenic total. And this is mainly because of meat consumption. And this photo shows exactly cattle on a farm in the Amazon after forest clearing. Native vegetation is destroyed in Brazil to make way for soybean monoculture, an export commodity used primarily for animal feed. Brazil ranks 4th in the world in terms of cumulative emissions. And of course, because of deforestation, and the green part of each column corresponds to deforestation. Brazilian emissions increased by 9.6% in 2019 compared to 2018, mainly because of deforestation. Brazilian agribusiness is directly or indirectly responsible for 72% of Brazil's emissions in 2018. These two systems grow in synergy and will not abandon fossil fuel in this decade, as shown by this graph. And probably not even the next decade. Global oil demand set to plateau, not decline by 2040, according to the International Energy Agency. Fossil fuels will still dominate energy in 20 years despite green power rising. Coal, oil, and natural gas will still account for 77% of global demand of primary energy by 2040. Oil consumption will increase by about 750,000 barrels a day each year to reach 103 million a day in 2030. Where does the fossil fuel money come from? Since the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have poured $3.8 trillion into fossil fuels. Loans and underwriting for the coal industry have increased since the Paris Agreement. The last report of the production gap says governments plan to produce more than twice the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The production gap has remained largely unchanged since our first analysis in 2019. So, by 2040, the global economy will still be emitting around 35 gigatons of CO2. So we'll be between the red and the brown lines. But we should be here to avoid catastrophe, around 10 gigatons of CO2. Atmospheric concentrations of CO2 show a rate of increase between 2 and 3 parts per million per year. Even without further acceleration, CO2 will reach 450 parts per million in less than 15 years, and 450 parts per million implies a 2 degrees Celsius warming. The most accurate prediction about the chances of success of the Paris Agreement was made in 2013 by Yves Deboer, the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He said the only way that the 2015 agreement can achieve a 2 degrees Celsius goal is to shut down the whole global economy. The destruction of the web of life stems from an economy based on the paradigm of growth, which makes it incapable of perceiving itself as a subsystem of ecology.
Well, that video, it illustrates so much. And when you think about, he mentioned stopping the economy. Of course, over the past couple of years, we've seen a real, for tragic reasons, a real stopping of the economy. And indeed, we did see a massive drop in fossil fuels. In fact, many oil companies in particular lost significant amounts of revenue. And yet now we are seeing a complete resurgence, a roaring forward of fossil fuel, of oil, and even coal. I want to begin to turn it to you, Jonathan. When we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there are a lot of different approaches, some, in this Paris Agreement, some market-based mechanisms for greenhouse gas emission reductions. There's also a very significant private market in trading and offsets in carbon. And so I'm interested to hear from you, what are some of the pluses and minuses as we think about ecological economics and moving away from growth models?
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm going to speak a bit about carbon markets, their current status, and some of the risks associated with these markets. Specifically, I'm going to focus on what are called baseline and crediting markets, which is where carbon credits are traded, where a carbon credit represents a ton of CO2 that has been reduced somewhere else that a buyer will purchase and often will use to claim that they've reduced their own emissions. When carbon markets are designed well and function well, you can have a situation where the projects that generate carbon credits could protect human rights and the environment. Another crucial point is that we need to have a system whereby we go beyond offsetting, where we're not just assuming that one credit compensates for emissions elsewhere. So this is going beyond the sort of business as usual mindset that sometimes underpins how carbon markets operate. And this brings me to a point that emissions need to be reduced first at home, in-house, by countries and by firms. So the first important point is obviously to respect the mitigation hierarchy and reduce one's own emissions first. Another thing that we see sometimes in carbon markets is that a carbon credit is occasionally counted twice by more than one firm or entity. And obviously that's problematic. If you have 1 ton that's being counted by 2 entities, you have some complicated carbon accounting that's not complicated, it's actually just false. So in a climate-safe world, we could have carbon markets, if they were to uphold all these principles, they could perhaps generate some benefits. However, in reality, what we see is that this is not always what happens. So some carbon crediting projects can actually harm people, so they can displace peoples. For instance, certain afforestation or reforestation projects, not all of them, but it can happen. Like I mentioned, many buyers of carbon credits kind of rely on the system to just say that they've neutralized all their emissions by buying carbon credits, when in reality, it's just offsetting it. It's not actually addressing the root problem, which is to actually reduce emissions in the first place. Like I mentioned, this problem with double counting of emissions is really a problematic practice that we can see. So this is just to bring back to the point that Raya mentioned. So for carbon markets, there are those that are under compliance systems, but then there's also the voluntary carbon market, which is really kicking off right now. So there's been many task forces and initiatives that seek out to scale up the voluntary carbon market, and this comes with some risks. So this is just, if you can see on the graph here, it's just showing essentially how much this voluntary carbon market has kicked off. And what's important here is that the voluntary carbon market is voluntary in the sense that companies are deciding to engage in this, and it's not very strongly regulated. And the issue with this is that there's not a lot of supervision over what's being claimed, how it's being claimed, and what projects are actually generating the credits. Just to show here, the top green portion are credits from REDD+ credits, which are from avoided deforestation. Now, of course, we do need to stop deforestation, that's not the point, but when you generate credits from these projects, oftentimes the baselines on how they determine how many credits can be generated, it depends on a hypothetical scenario about how much deforestation this project will stop, but you can't necessarily know that, what will happen for sure. It's a hypothetical scenario, and there's been quite a lot of documentation showing that sometimes these are inflated baselines, which means you have credits that are essentially hot air that are being traded and claimed by somebody else to say that they have reduced their own emissions. So you have some problems there. And the other big gray chunk is from renewable energy. Again, we do need renewable energy. That's not the point. The issue is that sometimes these projects don't rely on the revenue generated from the carbon credits to operate. If they don't rely on this revenue, then buying the carbon credit doesn't impact whether or not the project would exist, which means that it's a basic requirement for a carbon credit that's not always satisfied. So often we hear that carbon credits are located in developing countries, carbon crediting projects. This is true, and you can see there's a lot of growth here in Asia Pacific regions and Central and South America. But there's also a lot of credits being generated in North America and Europe as well. This is just going back to the point that a credit doesn't always represent 1 ton of CO2 if it doesn't satisfy some pretty basic requirements, and the problem is that they don't always satisfy these requirements. The average price of credits currently on the voluntary carbon market is under about $5 US. And the problem here is that this can discourage action. If a company can just buy a carbon credit that's under $5 US, instead of actually taking action to reduce its own emissions, you have sort of a disincentive to take action. And here, I'll just conclude on this, kind of looping back to where we are currently right now. As I'm speaking, there are actually negotiations at the moment to conclude Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which would establish market mechanisms. Essentially, what they're discussing right now is establishing rules for how a UN-based carbon market would operate. And suffice it to say that with all the points that I've underlined so far, there's currently a lot at stake. If you don't design these markets well, you could actually have a scenario where the inverse happens of what we're seeking for the Paris Agreement, where emissions could increase overall rather than being reduced. So there's a significant risk here. I think with that, I will conclude.
Well, thank you so much. That was just really revealing. We want to see sort of these market-based solutions as a panacea, and there are real things to be looking out for. How could any of us, if we buy an offset, or if a company we buy from says, "Oh, we buy offsets, so this product is sustainable," how is anyone to know if that's a legitimate claim, if there's real, reduction behind it?
Yeah, that's precisely a good point. There's not a lot of transparency often with these claims, and actually we just looked into so-called carbon-neutral fossil fuel claims, which is where oil and gas companies will buy carbon credits to claim that their cargo of LNG is carbon neutral. So that comes with a lot of problems, obviously, and sometimes it's offset with nature-based solutions. So a tree is not going to be there forever, and if you're offsetting that with CO2 that's going to stay in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years, it's not a great move.
I saw the one slide you showed, which was recent explosive growth in the private market. I can only imagine what would take place if we were to have this international market happen. I mean, in light of what we're talking about, like, what would be a way to begin to fix this or fix this issue? Or is there a way to have a market like this that would actually work?
Well, we would need some regulation. I mean, if Article 6 were agreed in a very robust way, it actually could send a positive signal and help rein in some of this. The voluntary carbon market isn't directly impacted by that, but I think there's also something that we talk about is kind of changing the way these claims are presented. So instead of saying that you're offsetting your emissions, we sort of promote a contribution claim, which is where a firm could buy a carbon credit because they can have positive impacts for projects. They're not all bad, but a firm could buy a carbon credit, but they wouldn't say that they've reduced their emissions by doing it. They just wouldn't claim to reduce their own emissions. That way you could still disperse some finance, private finance, to projects, and you kind of get around some of the dubious claims that are being made.
Some common sense regulation and truth in advertising.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for that. Now that we've talked about some of the market solutions that that the world is thinking about to address the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, I want to talk to you, because I know about your work, to get back to this idea of how economic systems can actually promote social justice, well-being. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about your work in your recent book.
Thanks, Rhea, and hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. And I think what you've heard from Jonathan there is almost this very pervasive, we want to have our cake and eat it obsession with the offsetting. And it's almost, you see that equivalent in the approach to the economic system. And as you heard at the beginning in the presentation, we've got an economic system that is designed for and dependent on economic growth. And almost the best that's being offered at the moment is to put a nice adjective in front of that growth, whether it's sustainable or shared or more inclusive growth. You see all these sorts of nice adjectives put in front of it. And I think that just shows the limits of our collective imaginations, that we cannot yet imagine, let alone build, this sort of economy that is better than growth. And we heard it in that previous section, that you've got almost this idea that the economy is a goal in its own right. And if you think back to the early 1990s, where you had that idea of sustainable development and you had those 3 pillars, I think that's one of the most problematic images or icons that you can imagine, because it essentially says the economy is up there with society and the environment as a goal in its own right, and we should prioritise it equally. Whereas what we need to do is take what feminist economists and what ecological economists have been telling us for decades and just be reminded that the economy sits within society and the two sit within nature. And we need to reimagine the economy as being in service of what I describe as the higher order goals of social justice on a healthy planet. And in a way that sounds like quite a simple flip in our minds to make, to really disentangle the difference between the means and the ends. And yet still, when we're talking about recovery out of COVID, how do we measure recovery? Incremental increases in GDP. We are so stuck in this narrow cognitive bandwidth that we cannot dare to imagine. And yet, what's hopeful is that there are so many examples of small projects, amazing creative businesses, even some policies coming out of the corridors of power that are starting to recognise.
Tell us about some of those.
I'm
fascinated.
So I'll give you one example. So we're here in Scotland, and I'm really proud to say that Scotland is one of the founding members of a group called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, WeGo, which is Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, and Wales. And these are countries who really recognise that in the 21st century, the success of a country cannot be narrowed down to faster GDP growth. What they want to do is wrap their heads around how do we put human and ecological well-being at the forefront of economic policy making. But they also recognise that none of them on their own have the answers. And so what they're doing through WeGo is sharing what they're playing about with, what they're learning, what their shared challenges are, and hopefully going on a journey of continuous improvement about that. Really, let's admit it, it's one hell of a complicated challenge. It's multifaceted. There are changes at all levels of the system we need, from the very purpose of the economy to how we design the rules of the game, our tax systems, our incentive structures, the infrastructure in our cities, and also how we design businesses. What's the very purpose of business as well? What sort of business models do we need in the 21st century? Because it's complicated. It's not sadly, one simple flick of a light switch. And so these governments are trying to learn from each other and go on a journey of continuous improvement about redesigning their economies. So we're not stuck in that sort of 20th century social democratic process of growing the economy big, and then we sequester some money back through taxes, and we all know we only have to look at the Paradise Papers to see how hard that is, given the extent of tax evasion and avoidance. And then what do? We see governments scrambling around using that money to patch and repair the collateral damage of a growth-obsessed economic system. And so the wellbeing economy agenda is saying we can do better than that. If we raise our gaze from just putting sticking plasters over the damage of the current system, and we design an economy that gets things right first time around, that's the way to deliver human and ecological well-being.
That is a fascinating concept, because if somebody who, just even in he studies the energy sector, of course this is represented in the financial sector, you see these tremendous booms and busts, this idea of plasters that you're putting over. What's an example of, one of the type of changes or redesigns that, could be a way forward?
So think at the moment we have the economic system that generates a huge amount of economic inequality and injustice. And I think we need to constantly remind ourselves when we're talking about climate change that climate change is a social justice question, two sides of the same coin, and I say that deliberately because it's the economy that links the two. So we have hugely unequal outcomes in terms of the economic system. The current solution is a little bit of redistribution through taxes and welfare. It's maybe some top-up payments for people who are working but still can't afford to put food on the table. It's maybe a bit of intervention through housing benefit because of a dysfunctional housing market. A more ambitious approach that says we can do better than that, let's ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting, would be to design businesses that generate more equal outcomes. So worker cooperatives, which have been around for centuries, a classic example where you have the employees owning the capital, where they're not designed to extract wealth and take it up to remote shareholders, where they keep that money circulating amongst members. Community wealth building, another really important piece of that jigsaw, where we use procurement and purchasing policies to keep money circulating in local economies, again, rather than being extracted outwards to some remote shareholder, where it's literally a zero-sum game. Every pound or dollar that goes to a shareholder is one that's not paying the workers, not going to local communities, and not supporting the environment. So it's essentially being more ambitious with how we design the economy so that the government doesn't need to constantly come in and deal with what are ultimately avoidable demands. If we were bolder with what we expected out of our economy, we could have a very different sort of outcomes for society and for the planet.
And these catastrophic, issues that come up, they are huge. They are vastly costly, and they include an ability to prepare for climate crisis, be that in the energy system or other systems. And we definitely know climate justice, that climate change impacts the poor, it impacts women,
Absolutely.
it impacts children first. You mentioned feminist economics. What might be a feminist idea that we could put into practice?
Well, partly recognising the extent to which work that happens in the home, which, as we've seen just in the last few 18 months, has largely been done by women, the double burden that women shoulder in terms of the care economy. We see how our labour markets, the formal side of the economy, depends upon that. And there's almost this sort of pernicious paradox where we've got an economic system that depends on the care economy, doesn't value it, extracts from it, but it relies on that for its existence. And so a good step towards that would be recognising the input of the care economy, redistributing it, so we have the blokes carrying more of their fair share, and also having jobs that enable people to attend to their caring commitments, let alone getting involved in community activities, democratic processes. So jobs that you don't have to work 80 hours a week, maybe doing 3 jobs on minimum wage just to put food on the table. So really thinking about how we design and share work that is out there.
Wow, well, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you as well, Jonathan. I'm Raya Salter. Thank you so much for joining us at COP with Facing Future TV.